Very good. Today we are joined by Nino Schmidt. He is an outstanding expert in higher education and specifically around the social dimension of higher education. He's the director of the Institute for the Development of Higher Education in Zagreb in Croatia, and currently co-chairing for the second time now, for the second mandate, the Bologna follow-up working group on the social dimension for the period of 2021 till 2024. Additional to that, as I said, he has been leading the group before and was responsible and the architect for a groundbreaking document addressing the social dimension in higher education, the European Principles and Guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education, which helps 49 countries in the area to improve social dimension policies within their respective constituencies. His main expertise is in the social dimension in institutional governance and strategic management of higher education, but also in financing and quality assurance of higher education. He has been working as a senior expert in the network of economics and education in Europe, but also has been doing consultancies with the World Bank and the European Commission, various government bodies, higher education institutions and professional organizations. And we are really, really happy that he takes out time of his weekend, of his Sunday to join us here. Nino, thank you so much for taking the time. And without further ado, I will give it over to you for your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian, for inviting me to participate in the work of your academy. I'll now try to share my presentation, and I'll just ask you, Sebastian, to confirm once I will upload it.
It looks good.
And just please confirm that you can see the full screen now.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Sebastian, once again, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all. I'm, as Sebastian has presented me, Nino Schmidt. Originally, I'm Executive Director of the Institute for the Development of Education, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to speak on the topic that is very dear to me. And as Sebastian has explained, I have been deeply involved in the past 5 years into the social dimension within the Bologna process. So in my presentation, so in next 40 minutes, I will be speaking on a new decade for the social dimension within the Bologna process. And I will try to explain why do I believe that this decade to 2030 could be considered the decade of the social dimension in the European higher education area. So in my presentation, I will start with a presentation of the results of a survey, impact of COVID on the social dimension of higher education. And I will try to show the influence of the pandemic on some new policy developments and opportunities for the social dimension in the European higher education area. Then I'll go more in deep into the one document that I consider very important. Sebastian has mentioned it just now, Principles and Guidelines for Social Dimension, and will explain how I envisage we could build a European movement for the social dimension of higher education. So first, I will start with a presentation of one survey related to impact of COVID-19 on the social dimension of higher education. This survey has been performed by the European Students' Union in cooperation with the University of Zagreb and other colleagues in Europe. And what we've seen from this survey, but also from other literature, that during the pandemic, at-risk students were and still are disproportionately affected. So COVID-19 crisis is exacerbating pre-existing education disparities rather than causing those disparities. So now at-risk students face a range of additional challenges in accessing, participating fully in their study programs and successfully completing their studies. So the survey of the European Students' Union from 2021 has showed and provides actually an overview of challenges faced by the students in Europe during COVID pandemic. As for learning and teaching challenges, we know that almost 60% of students reported they do not always have a reliable internet connection. Almost 70% of students reported they do not always have access to course study materials, and almost 35% of them did not often have a quiet place to study. As for funding challenges, we know that almost 40% of students who worked during their studies during the pandemic or since the start of pandemic, they lost their jobs. So almost 40%. And this is also the reason why almost 15% of them had significant financial concerns about their study costs. Also, when we speak about pandemic and the experience of studying in the pandemic, we know that students' well-being has been affected. Students have frequently felt frustrated and anxious in their academic activities since on-site classes have been cancelled, and lower levels of general well-being were reported by students who do not have a supportive social network. So from this survey of the European Student Union, we know that almost 10% of students indicated that they do not have several people they can trust to help solve their problems. So this survey enabled us to identify students who are more likely to face difficulties in adjusting to studying during the COVID pandemic lockdown. And these are the students at lower levels of study. So for them, it was really more difficult to adjust to studying during the pandemic. The same for students lacking a supportive social network, students who reported having mental health problems, students with lower levels of digital skills, and students who do not have a quiet place to study, a good internet connection, and material for studying at their disposal. So as conclusion, I can say that the impact of COVID on the social and in the short term, so until I would say next year, and in the medium term up to 2025, is that the pandemic will have negative impact on equity and social inclusion, not only in tertiary, but also in pre-tertiary education, which will then create a knock-on effect of A, reducing equal access to higher education, and B, it will lower the level of participation of at-risk students in higher education in the upcoming years. Of course, there is a long-term also scenario that does not look very nice. I mean, in the long-term scaring effects for young people under the age of 25 or the COVID generation, this long-term scenario could result in an unprecedented decline in social mobility due to rising economic and educational inequalities. So the question is what we can do. Now we know what are the challenges. We know now which groups are particularly vulnerable and what the pandemic has created within the student body in Europe. And we know that both public authorities and higher education institutions could help. So here are some recommendations on how public authorities, especially in Europe, could help solving some of these problems, or could maybe ameliorate some of these problems. So as for learning and teaching, public authorities should support and should provide the means to higher education institutions to improve initial and continuing professional training, both for academic and administrative staff, on how to effectively replace on-site learning and teaching methods with online delivery. It can be done by creating cooperative national structures or by securing the exchange of good practices on a national level, or facilitating peer learning and inter-institutional staff development, both in terms of the technical aspects of online delivery, but also pedagogic practices, including assessment particularly. As for student services, public authorities should have policies that enable higher education institutions to provide effective, accessible, and user-friendly counseling and guidance for students in order to find adequate solutions for academic, health, and career challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The previous European Student Survey, Union survey, showed that students very often do not seek institutional support for problems they may have. So from survey, we know that students usually relate to their friends, to their colleagues at the university, or even they relate to the family, but very rare they relate or they ask for institutional support. So there is a huge space for improvement to create an institutional support through counseling and guidance for students. And finally, as for funding, an emergency fund for helping students to ameliorate the negative consequences caused by the COVID-19 pandemic should be established by public authorities, and it should provide grants to underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable students. So these are the recommendations for public authorities, but we know that certainly policymakers at higher education institutions level also could help ameliorate the negative consequences of COVID pandemic. As for learning and teaching, we know that on-site lectures and seminars and practical classes are replaced by online delivery, but higher education institutions should secure that online or blended learning secures that students achieve all planned learning outcomes. While working in the online environment, higher education institutions should secure easy online access to course study materials for all students. From the survey, we've seen that almost 70% of students did not have the access to course study materials, and it has to be changed. As for competence building, higher education institutions should provide adequate training for building digital competencies to both students and teaching and administrative staff in order to enable them to study and work effectively and efficiently in the online environment. As for student services, higher education institutions should, of course, provide counseling and guidance for students in order to find adequate solutions for academic health and career challenges caused particularly by the COVID pandemic. And as for funding, higher education institutions should adjust their tuition policies to the new circumstances for students who demonstrated that they are negatively affected by the COVID pandemic. So they should consider prolonging tuition fee payment due dates, or introducing installment plans for tuition payments, or decreasing the amount of tuition fees, or even, if it's possible, canceling tuition fees. So these were the recommendations that we know that could help ameliorate negative impact of pandemic on social dimension. But the question is, do we have policymakers in the public administration or at higher education institutions that could basically implement these recommendations? Now, therefore, I will explain how I see some new policy developments and opportunities for the social dimension in the European higher education area, and then you will be capable to conclude whether this external environment could be conducive to and capable to implement all of the before explained recommendations. So we've seen the negative consequences of COVID pandemic, but I think that we should also consider what opportunities the COVID crisis provides for addressing challenges faced by higher education systems and universities. I think that if we see what opportunities the crisis provides, I think that we will be capable maybe understand that the crisis also provides an opportunity to place the inclusion and equity as a top priority in the efforts to address the disruption caused by COVID-19. And we already see that some processes in the European higher education area go in this direction. So 2020 Rome Ministerial Conference, at which 49 ministers of higher education in Europe agreed and actually defined 3 goals for European higher education area until 2030. And we see that one of these goals is related to building an inclusive European higher education area. At this conference, under the goal of building an inclusive European higher education area, ministers adopted a new important strategic document, Principles and Guidelines for Social Dimension. And the novelty of this document is that now for the first time we have guidelines. So this document presents guidelines and they are intended to advise policymakers on how the principles for social dimension should be implemented in practice within their national higher education systems. This document, Principles and Guidelines for Social Dimension, is an integral part of the 2020 Rome Ministerial Communiqué, which means that 49 ministers have politically committed to its implementation. And that's why I think that this document will be very important for the future development of the social dimension in higher education in Europe. Another important stakeholder in Europe, European University Association, which is an umbrella organization of European universities, in its new strategic document, Universities Without Walls, and in which provides a vision for European universities for 2030, they have defined one of the 3 key areas in which European universities see major potential for moving forward in increasing societal engagement and contributing to sustainable development. And this is related to strengthening of their civic engagement. And in this document, they explicitly say that universities and their missions will widely benefit from equity and inclusion, and it is therefore in their core interest to promote these values in society. So this strategic document also opens new opportunities for topics such as equity, social inclusion, and social dimension in higher education. European Commission also in its document Achieving the European Education Area by 2025 has one of the 6 goals that is related to fostering inclusion and gender equality in higher education. And they say that educational attainment and achievement should be decoupled from social, economic, and cultural status to ensure that education and training system boost the abilities of every individual and enable upward social mobility. So this document again also speaks about inclusion and has placed the inclusion high in their agenda. And finally, I don't know if you know, but in Europe there is relatively new initiative called European Universities Initiative, created by the European Commission in 2019, and these are alliances of universities across Europe. And we've seen that some of these European university alliances have a mission that is dedicated to fostering inclusive higher education. So I believe that European Universities Initiative is really a very good platform also for fostering social inclusion, equity, and social dimension in higher education in the upcoming period. So I think that you would agree with me that all these developments in Europe are really very favorable for social dimension. And I think that maybe we, from my point of view, have really a unique opportunity to further develop social dimension within European higher education area. And I think that the upcoming decade to 2030 is really a very important period for making big improvements within this policy area. Therefore, I have chosen now one document that I have already mentioned before, Principles and Guidelines for Social Dimension, and I will go more in deep into this document because I think that this document that is adopted by the ministers of the European higher education area provides really tools that can foster the social dimension in basically 49 countries of the European higher education area. Today, I'm mentioning social dimension in higher education, but maybe you have asked yourself, what does social dimension mean? I mean, we mention in higher education social inclusion, equity, but social dimension may be not quite understandable for all of the people in higher education. And I think it is important maybe to provide here some historical background for this term, because the term social dimension in higher education has been introduced into the Bologna process in 2001 by students representatives in the Bologna process. And at that time, there was no clear definition what does social dimension mean. And at that time, social dimension was connected or referred to inclusion of underrepresented students. Later in the Bologna process in 2003, social dimension was connected with widening access to higher education. Later in 2005, it was related to equitable access to higher education. So there was no clear definition of the term, and only at a ministerial conference in London in 2007, we created the first complete definition of the social dimension that says that the composition of the student body entering, participating in, and completing higher education at all levels should correspond to the heterogeneous social profile of society at large. So this was the very first definition of the term social dimension. But then later again, within the Bologna process, again, somehow this definition, it seemed that the ministers and the stakeholders in Europe somehow forgot this definition. And in 2009, again, the term referred more to widening participation, later more to flexibility of entry routes. Then in 2015, the link was established between social dimension and lifelong learning. So we've seen that basically more than 15 years, we didn't use one definition for social dimension. And therefore, at the ministerial conference in Paris in 2018, the ministers decided, okay, now there is a time that we define the concept and that we create a strategic document that will help countries implement social dimension with their higher education systems. At that time, ministers in 2018, they have created a new body within the Bologna follow-up group called Advisory Group for Social Dimension. And the objective of this group in the period 2018 to 20 was to develop a common understanding, so the definition for the social dimension in higher education, and also to develop a strategic document with principles and guidelines for social dimension. And I'm glad that in 2020, the ministers adopted this new forward-looking strategic document, principles and guidelines. So this document now has the new definition of the social dimension. This new definition takes as its starting point this previous definition from London that says that the composition of the student body entering, participating in and completing higher education at all levels should correspond to the heterogeneous social propriety of society at large. So this definition from London contains policy levers for identifying and improving the prospects of underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable students. But this new group also has enlarged the definition from London in a way that it has stressed that the social dimension should encompass also the creation of an inclusive environment in higher education that fosters equity. So we have new elements: equity, diversity, and is responsive to the needs of the local community. So now with this new definition, public authorities and higher education institutions are expected to integrate the principles of social dimension into the core higher education mission. So into the learning and teaching, into the research and innovation, into the outreach, but then also into institutional governance and management, and also into the policies for empowering both students and staff. So this document, principles and guidelines, is important because it has this new, now agreed definition, complete definition for the social dimension. The document contains 10 principles for the social dimension for the upcoming decade until 2030. Principles should be understood as high-level statements that serve as a basis for the conceptualization of different policies for social dimension enhancement, while guidelines are recommendations intended to advise policymakers on how the principles should be implemented in practice. This document also has a glossary of terms. What does underrepresented students, disadvantaged students, or vulnerable students mean? Here you can see these 10 principles for social dimension, and you see that they can range for stressing the importance of taking strategic approach to social dimension, importance of having a supportive legal framework, having reliable data, effective counseling and guidance for students, having sustainable funding, also that one principle that relates to inclusive and equitable international mobility programs, and also to community engagement in higher education that promotes social dimension. So here you can see a range of these 10 new principles for social dimension, and maybe I can highlight only 3 so that you understand what we have created. So one principle is legal regulations and administrative rules should allow sufficient flexibility in the design, organization, and delivery of study programs to reflect the diversity of students' needs. And then there is a guideline under this principle, which says that higher education institutions should be able to organize full-time, part-time studies, flexible study modes, blended and distance learning, as well as to recognize prior learning. So these guidelines, on this example, you can see that these guidelines basically tells to public authorities how they should implement the above principle related to legal regulations and administrative rules. There is also one more, I think that this is the third or fourth principle, which says that it is important to ensure a holistic approach to the social dimension, aiming to create coherent policies from early childhood education through schooling to higher education and throughout lifelong learning. So with these principles, we wanted to show that, okay, we cannot speak about social dimension in higher education if we do not have a developed social dimension also on the previous levels of education. And maybe one more example, which is also quite novelty in European higher education, and it's related to community engagement, which the principle says higher education institutions should ensure that community engagement in higher education promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion, because such engagement then provides a holistic basis on which universities can address a broad range of societal needs, including those of vulnerable and disadvantaged group, while at the same time enriching their teaching, research, and other core functions. So these principles, principle would like to establish close links between universities and their local environments and their local stakeholders. These principles and guidelines are not to be seen as a checklist, but rather as an instrument for the development of instrument for developing fit for purpose, always context-specific national and institutional strategies and policies for social dimension. So we expect public authorities that they will engage in a policy dialogue with higher education institutions and other stakeholders on how these principles can be translated and implemented both at the national system level and also institutional level. And only if they really have a fruitful dialogue with these stakeholders, we believe then that public authorities could make concrete and tangible progress over the next decade in developing social dimension within European higher education area. So I believe that now you've seen the importance of this relatively new document and how this document could really help public authorities in Europe to further develop social dimension. So we have, as you have seen, important documents that support social dimension in Europe. I think that I have also explained that we also have some new positive policy developments on a European level that favor social dimension. And I think it is really important that we build, maybe if maybe you can switch off your microphone, that would be great. Okay, thank you. So I think it is important that we keep this positive environment and that we foster this positive environment for social dimension. And that's why I think it is important to continue building European movement for the social dimension of higher education. So from top-down approach, I think that we could focus on building capacities of public authorities and universities for the social dimension and on facilitating a learning journey for social dimension rather than on compliance. So I think that in the upcoming period, from top-down perspective, we should explore and foster transnational learning, and building capacity tools for social dimension, or scale up valuable social dimension initiatives through different incentives. I believe that also working group on social dimension until 2024, which is created within the Bologna follow-up group, could also help in this creating the European movement, because In this group, we have basically more than 30 representatives of public authorities all around Europe. This working group is now developing indicators for social dimension principles and is also developing a system of monitoring the implementation of the principles and guidelines, and also is organizing peer support activities for social dimension to support the implementation in different member states. So from this top-down approach, I think it will be important to stick to these activities and then to complement this top-down with bottom-up approach. I think it is important from bottom-up approach, identify public authorities and universities that are committed to the social dimension, and then to build a network of institutions committed to the social dimension and organize capacity building events with them. There is also an opportunity to build other alliances and then scale up so that we can connect, for instance, the social dimension agenda to the European Universities Initiative, or we could connect social dimension agenda to similar global networks. And then the combination of this top-down approach and bottom-up approach will create a European movement for the social dimension that could really enhance this policy area until 2030. So thank you for your attention. I will now stop sharing, and I hope that I have explained what is happening related to social dimension now within European higher education area, and I'm glad to answer any question you may have. Sebastian?
Thank you so much. It was very, very insightful, and I'm sure the colleagues have questions. As always, colleagues, if you have questions, just raise your hand and we will go one after the other. The floor is yours. Anyone has any questions, any comments? I see Jenna. Jenna, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Apologies, my background. So my name is Jenna. I'm the postgraduate representative for the Union of Students in Ireland. I'm also currently a research student, and my research is on virtual communities of practice for postgraduate researchers. Now, I'm very new to the whole student union area and student politics, and I'm really interested in how it works in Europe. I've just managed to get a grip of how it works in Ireland. And I just suppose the postgraduate research structure in Ireland is very different than other European countries. We either pay to be a postgraduate or you get a small bursary. So you're not classed as a worker, you're classed as a student. So I'm wondering about, first of all, the European Student Union survey. Was that undergraduates or all students? And was there a percentage that was postgraduate and postgraduate researchers that answered that survey, or are you aware?
So I don't know, Sebastian, because maybe also you have more information because you were at ESO at that time. But so this survey was basically done on all of the students in Europe, which includes both undergraduate and graduate students. And the sample was quite large. I think it was more than 15,000 students. However, I would definitely recommend, because in the introductory part of the results of this survey, there is really an explanation of the methodology and also a quite detailed explanation related on the sample that was taken into the consideration. So the survey is available on the website of the European Students Union. So Jenna, I would definitely recommend that you find the precise information there. But I don't know, Sebastian, if you have some more information, but I'm sure that certainly you can provide a link to colleagues so that they can find more details.
The letter I can, for the first thing, I think you said everything. Sorry, Jenna, back to you. I'm going to share the link in the chat.
Oh yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. So I suppose the other question, I find it difficult on where to look for, I suppose, postgraduate documents and documents to help me with my work on specifically postgraduate and postgraduate researchers. Is there a place on the internet, or are there like certain, I suppose, agencies or committees or boards that you'd recommend me taking a look at?
Good question. I should definitely think about that. It is. I now you made me aware that really to find information, particularly for postgraduate students, maybe more challenging than for like undergraduate or graduate students. So I will definitely think about it, and if I will have some recommendations, I will send it to Sebastian, and I'm sure then that Sebastian could forward to all of you, including to you, Jenna. I'm really sorry that I do not have this information right now from.
No, no problem at all. You can't, you're not like a file of facts. I forgot to say as well when I first came in that thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I really appreciate your time today and for answering my questions. I just want to highlight one quick thing, that we have a postgraduate research student survey in Ireland, and that there's a certain, my own research has led me to review postgraduate social and intellectual isolation, of which firstly the social isolation is well documented, but the kind of topic related intellectual isolation isn't. And the postgraduate research student survey, the results are there just for different things of the high isolation rates amongst postgraduates. And if anyone is a postgraduate, they might be interested in having a look at that survey. But I suppose I'm specifically, that's the area I'm working in and I'm interested in, and also I'm part of the Global Student Forum and postgraduate steering group. So I have a massive interest in anything postgraduate. Apologies for the sticky questions. And thank you again for all your time. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Jenna, for your questions. May I just ask at which university you are doing your postgraduate research?
So I did a master's in UL, University of Limerick, a thought master's. I'm currently doing my research postgrad in TUS, a Technological University of Shannon in Midlands. It was formerly Limerick Institute of Technology, but it formed together with Athlone. I did my thought master's many moons ago. And we are part of Run EU, the Regional Universities Network. If you have any questions, I'll just pop my email in there. Feel free to.
Yeah, I'm just asking it, and this will be like my last answer. I asked this question because we work with the Irish University Association, and more specifically with the Campus Engage, I think, initiative within this, and it has a couple of Irish universities being in the network. So that's why I asked just to see whether your universities may be within this network. But thank you for your information. I will go back to you if I will have like more information on what you have asked. So thank you.
Well, I would love to find out more as well about the working group because of my own research. So I would love, I was Googling it there to find out while we were talking earlier. But social inclusion is really, really important. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah. So this website that I have put in the chat is the website of the European Higher Education Area. But when you come on the main page, you will find all working structures, including working groups for social dimension. And we are really trying to keep our work very transparent, and so you can find really all of the materials. At the moment, we are, as I said, we are developing indicators for the principles for social dimension. So we would be grateful if postgraduates all across Europe could help us, creating these indicators, because this is really a demanding job. But yes, so if you would take a look to what we are doing, and if you have any proposal or idea, just please send us. We would be more than grateful. I'll put my email once again here. So
I got it from the slides.
Okay, perfect then.
I took screenshots of all the slides. Were so interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. Sorry, everyone, for taking up a bit of time.
No worries, Jenna. And just one thing I wanted to add here, we have a freshly established working group on postgraduate affairs in the Global Student Forum, and Ellen is the chair of that one. So if you're interested in that kind of work and might be interested in joining, drop her a message. I think
I'm already part of it, Sebastian.
Ah, okay. Well, fair enough. Then
yeah. No, I met Ellen here in this group. So yeah. Thank you.
Cheers. All right, Bismarck, moving on to you.
Yeah, thank you, Seb. Thank you very much, Nino. This was certainly one of the topics I was looking forward to, and I'm very excited that you delivered so well. I was excited because of the topic. Secondly, because of your name. There's a former Chelsea player called Branislav. So when I saw Ninoslav, I was like, okay, you might come from the same breed of names, and that was interesting for me. So thank you very much. I will be undertaking a thesis in the area of COVID-19, looking at government decisions, government policies during the period. And I was excited when I heard you talk about COVID-19 period. Especially from the African side, we saw the government cut down their budgets on education and diverted those monies to more health and other social services. So education suffered. And we want to see if they'll reverse and pretty much increase even their budget for education, and then also advocate that they do not cut education, but when the economy breaks down, it's education that will bring the economy back to life. And that is what I'm looking at do with the thesis. So I was excited to hear you talk about COVID-19 and how it made the European system change, how the policy dimensions change and all that. But my question, especially because of my thesis, I want to know if political will alone is enough, because in your presentation, you mentioned that the 49 ministers or so sort of given a political will show some kind of commitment to the document, the document you mentioned. Is political will alone enough? That's the first question. And secondly, in the said document on the principles and guidelines, is that a way to measure? But I see that there were principles, there were guidelines. Did the document provide for how to measure and maybe how to even exert pressure on these government appointees or elected personalities to implement the said principles and guidelines? And I'm asking this question because those will be some of the things I'll be looking at in my sector, my dimension in the African context. If government come to tell us that they will increase budget for education now, what should I be looking at for? How can I exert pressure on it? Is there a document, a policy document I can put forward in that regard? That's why this question is very important to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bismarck, for your questions. May Sebastian answer the question, or?
Sorry?
May I answer the question, because you...
Of course.
No, because I thought that you would like to collect maybe more questions and then
okay, that's also an option if you want to do that. Anyone?
No,
as you prefer, Nino.
Okay, because I'm like intervening into your space as a moderator. That's why I asked the question.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so Bismarck, once again, thank you for your question. Your first question related to is political will enough? The answer is no, it's not enough. And that's why when I was explaining on how to create a European movement for social dimension, I mentioned that it is important, from my perspective, that it is important to have this top-down approach, but then also bottom-up approach. By top-down approach, I mean, this top-down approach relates basically to the different initiatives of public authorities or policymakers, where political commitment is very important. But certainly, it is not sufficient, or it's not enough if it's not, from my perspective, complemented with this bottom-up approach. And that's why I think that it is important that students, different kind of unions of staff employed at higher education institutions, researchers, postgraduate researchers, and different networks that can basically that work in this area of social inclusion, social dimension, and equity. If they create alliances, if they create different networks, and then support this work from bottom up, then I think the combination of these two perspectives, top down and bottom up, then it could make, I think, a real progress in this policy area. Your second question, how to measure the implementation of principles, that's really very good question, but that's exactly the task of the Bologna follow-up working group for social dimension for the period 21-24. Because as I have explained, we have created principles in 2020, but now in the upcoming 3 years, we are creating indicators for each principle. So we have 10 principles, and then we will create indicators for each principles. And these indicators will then help public authorities measure the progress done within their national systems. We do have only now a working version of indicators, but we will complete our work until 2024. And I hope that by that time, I will have exact information how the governments and other stakeholders will be capable to measure the implementation of all 10 principles.
Yes, Seb, if I'm allowed.
Please, go ahead, yes.
Yes, so I want to find out, I imagine that measuring these processes, in my view, should be a continuous process, not an end measurement. Is that some kind of provisions of that kind to measure from time to time what the progress has been until the last one that has been done? But I imagine that should be, in my view, that should be how that should be, especially from my part of the world, where sometimes it's very difficult to hold leadership accountable. We cannot wait until the end to go and measure what they have done. That's I'm asking if that is also the process in your area. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good question again. I can explain. Since we are working on these indicators, I can inform you that we've decided that our approach to indicators is the following. First, we do not opt to create only quantitative indicators or only qualitative indicators, but we would like to develop a multidimensional indicators that allow context-specific solutions. So we believe that when working on social dimension, that we should always create context-specific solutions. So what I find important, or what Jenna would find important in Ireland, certainly is not relevant for Croatia or even in Bismarck for your country. So when we create indicators, we should allow these context-specific solutions. And also, what we agreed that we would like to have indicators that will be capable to measure the authenticity of engagement, which means that we do not want indicators that will be just to put, the mark in the checkbox. Okay, it's completed and then forgotten. So we would like to have indicators that will be capable to measure really the authenticity of this engagement, and then that it will show the real dedication of the system and institution to this policy area, which means, and that's the final point, that the whole point of creating these indicators is that they are implemented over the longer period and that they are repeated after a certain period. I think that we do not have a clear, in our working group, we do not have now a clear decision whether this measurement, once we will complete the indicator, should be done every, 3 years, every 5 years, or we do not know actually. We do not have now a clear picture of how long the cycle should last, but we will certainly give the recommendations that the application of indicators should happen, maybe in accordance with some surveys done through quality assurance, which then can be every 3, 4, 5 years. We will see, but I definitely agree with you that it is important that this is a continuous process. So I hope that I have answered your question. Please ask if you are not satisfied with my answer.
I am. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Anyone else, colleagues, that wants to comment, and there we go. Jenna, please.
I am so sorry. No one else is putting up their hand, and I'm really interested as well. There was another thing that dawned on me, that around gender equality. So the structure for research here doesn't, I suppose, doesn't support gender equality. And that is after you even qualify and you want to be a researcher, it doesn't support it either. So it's a real area I'm interested in, gender equality in education. And I was wondering if there are any countries that have best practices for gender equality that would be good to look at.
I have a very difficult question.
Sorry.
Yeah. I should really think about that. I have also written it down as for gender equality. And I will, Jenna, I have now also your email here. So I will let you know if I have some concrete examples. In the work of our BFUG working group for social dimension, I know that we've not mentioned, some real examples, and we didn't have peer learning activities related specifically to gender equality. So that's why I do not know now.
I can explain why I'm asking, just for your information. So our minister has committed to the European research area of gender equality, and also to the SDG goal. I think it's 4.7 or 4.5 gender equality in education. So it's something that we have to put a pre-budget submission to the government at the end of the year before I finish my term. And it's something that I want to incorporate, but also not only to give them a problem, but also give them a solution to make it easier, hopefully, that they may be able to do something. It's always handy to get the solution with the problem, as they say. So that's the reason I'm looking for it, to try and figure out what kind of structures work, funding models. There's obviously funding coming from Europe for this area. So all they need now is a structure to implement.
I see. Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Thanks again. Sorry for the awkward questions. As they said, you can't know everything. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Nino. I see that ESO presidency has their hand up. I suppose that's Martina.
Oh, I realize I did not change my name from the Zoom. Hi, Nino, and hi to everyone in the group. It's nice to see you all and nice to hear the presentation of what is usually I find a complex process. I have two questions, Nino, to ask. In regards to the working group, now you've given an overview of how social dimension was better defined over the years, and now there's the move towards the setting of indicators. So we really see this push towards more evidence-based policymaking. Do you think that we have the right recipe now to see the reforms for social dimension that we need so desperately? And if you do think that we have the right recipe, why do you think that is? And if not, what do you think is missing to achieve that? And the second question is relating to your work with student representatives in the BFUG working group, but also outside of that. What is your perspective on the impact of student participation in policy making, such as that of the working group of the Bologna process? And how do you see that it has, I'm sorry for a third question, how do you see that it has also had an impact on the work of IDE, of your Institute for Development for Education in Croatia in that respect?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for your question, Martina. It's nice to have you here. Martina is also co-chairing the working group for social dimension with me. So it's been a pleasure to work with the European Students' Union for such a long period. As for your first question, do we have a recipe for the reforms that we need? I think that the reforms, so from the Bologna follow-up perspective, I think that it's a really supranational structure that should help the reforms that should be taken at a national level. So I think that it is important on this supranational level, which is the Bologna follow-up group, that we create the documents and that we also create something concrete like indicators and tools that can help countries implement reforms. But I think that from the Bologna follow-up group, it would be very difficult to say, so this supranational level is not the level for making the reforms. I think that the reforms should be taken at the national level, or it can be taken at the level of some organizations like European Commission, because they do have tools like funds, for instance, that can make reforms then again at the national level. So I think that we are within the Bologna creating documents and indicators and tools that will help the reforms on a national level. So I just suppose that the national environments will appreciate what has been created on this supranational level, and that they will use it for their reforms. I just may say that from the perspective of the organization that is working in Croatia, and we cooperate now almost for a decade with the Ministry of Education, I must say that I can really see that these supranational documents and these European-wide initiatives and surveys, like for instance, Euro Student Survey, could really make a difference for the reforms on the national level. And I can clearly see, for instance, in Croatia, then that in a decade you can create the whole platform for social dimension improvement, and that's what we've done in Croatia. So I think that there are some good examples in Europe that are supporting social dimension. I would say that there are also countries that are much better, and Jenna, I would mention Ireland, because I think that Ireland is also the country that is investing a lot in the development of social dimension. So I think that we definitely do have some really very good examples around Europe. Martina, your second question, it's very complex, and I must say that I do not consider myself being really like very that I possess the expertise in the student representation. I think that our colleague Manya, and I see that she has presented also within this academy. She's really an expert into this topic. I can just stress that I think that it is so important and crucial that students are included in every aspect of the work of higher education. So I think that students must be present in all components that relate to higher education, which means in all components related to learning and teaching, research, outreach, but then also in the governance, management, and policies related to fostering staff and students. I know that sometimes students' representation is considered like it's important for governing structures, it's important for governing structure within the public authorities or higher education institutions, but sometimes they do not perceive that it is important to take this holistic approach and then to include students into the learning and teaching. And it's important to have them, you know, that they influence the learning and teaching process. The same for research, the same for outreach, and other components of work of universities. So my organization, Institute for the Development of Education, really advocates that students are present. We advocate for this holistic perspective that student representation must happen in all these dimensions related to higher education.
Thank you very much, Nino, for that answer. Martina, that answers your question, or you had any other comments?
Yes, it definitely does. And that was kind of what I was hinting at in terms of also the right recipe being what as in from my perspective, the way that I see it, the EHA has a good example in the way that involves so many stakeholders in the education sector to be working on these policy documents, these supranational documents. And the moment that you have all key stakeholders at the table, then you can be a bit more sure of the legitimacy of that document being applicable and able to benefit the majority of the people in the country or in the institution as well. Thank you, Nino.
Thank you, Martina.
Thank you, Martina. Are there any other colleagues that want to take the floor? Anything else that we want to discuss? Jenna is thinking. One more time.
Yeah, I have another question now. Again, Nino, this may not be something that's in your remit, and it just came to my mind about frameworks. And I noticed the frameworks in Ireland anyway have been implemented, but not always followed through. And because our colleges or higher education institutions are autonomous. And I'm just wondering if there's any good examples again of frameworks that have been implemented, but also So, for example, I sit on the National Framework for Doctoral Education Advisory Forum in Ireland, and I noticed that the framework hasn't been implemented into all the higher education institutions. And doctoral education in Ireland, there's a huge disparity amongst, education and the framework being implemented. And I'm wondering, one, is this normal? And two, is there any case studies where frameworks have been implemented, or you can measure how a framework has been implemented? Again, I don't expect you to know the answer, because it might be a little bit out of the remit, but I said it came to my mind and I said I'd ask. I very rarely get a chance to sit in a room with so many intelligent people who know a lot about the education system all the time. So I said I'd throw out all the questions, if that's okay.
So I can provide you answer from my perspective, but I think your question is really the question for all people here in the audience, because maybe they are aware of different frameworks. Martina and I, we have organized, I think, 3 or 4 peer learning activities last and this year, and we invited different stakeholders to present, and also to present some of their frameworks. We've seen a very interesting framework for fostering inclusive mobility in higher education. I think that it's inclusivemobility.eu. So this is the organization, it's called SIHO. It's in SIHO, SIHO. It's a supporting center for inclusive education in Belgium, in Flanders. And they have developed a very interesting, I would say, framework on how to foster mobility, but inclusive mobility. So the mobility that would include also underrepresented, vulnerable, and disadvantaged groups into different mobility programs. And then they allow really to find a solution for public authorities, for agencies, but then also for higher education institutions, but then also for individuals. So depending on who is the stakeholder, then the framework allows you then to measure and it allows you to structure the mobility process according to your needs. So that's one framework related to inclusive mobility. There is another one. Now I will promote a bit my organization, but we have developed something that is also intended for the whole Europe. It's related to community engagement in higher education. And it's called Framework for Fostering Community Engagement in Higher Education in Europe. And you can find this framework at a website. I will write it here. It's tepsi.eu, and there is a Tepsi toolbox, and within this toolbox we have this framework that is intended for fostering community engagement of higher education institutions. So higher education institutions are intended as stakeholders. So whoever would like to foster this field systematically over the longer period, they can do it by using our toolbox. So this is the website. I don't know, maybe Martina, if you're still with us, maybe I have forgotten some of the frameworks that we have heard. If you can complement, I'll be grateful. But Jenna, if I recall some more frameworks, I will let you know.
Thanks again. Thank you.
The top of my head, the moment I don't think of any more than the Tepsi toolbox, and I think that is quite a good framework. But if I think of any, then I'll pass them on.
I did not hear the last part. There was some issue with the connection, but I think the statement finished now. Yes. Colleagues, anyone left who wants to comment, ask a question? I would say we have another 5 minutes before closing down. So now is the time. If there's still something you want to ask, you want to discuss. In case not, I would just express once more the gratitude of the whole team to you, Nino, for taking the time for this session. I think it was really, really interesting. Learned a lot. And if you have any final words from your end, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much to you, Sebastian, but also to all of your colleagues here for being so proactive and being interested into this topic. And I really invite you that you follow the work of the BFUG Working Group for Social Dimension on the ICHEA.info. We will be really transparent, and whenever you think that you can contribute to our work, please contact us. We will be more than grateful, particularly as for indicator creations, as we discussed. So thank you once again, and thank you, Sebastian, for inviting me to join this group.
Thank you, Nino. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Take care. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.